So it's my privilege to officially kick off our very first session of this conference, The Times Are A-Changin', Political Trends and Colorado's Energy Future. Your guide for this journey this morning is a veteran political consultant, Sandra Hagen-Solon. Sandra guides clients in navigating the intersection of politics, policy, and business as the head of Capital Solutions, a leading full-spectrum government affairs firm that she founded at just 23 years old. Sandra represents business clients at the local, state, and federal levels, solving complex public affairs challenges for exceptional clients, including many of Colorado's leading corporate clients, Fortune 500 companies, and trade associations. Named a key Colorado influencer in 2019, one of the top 10 Colorado politicos to watch in 2018 by Colorado Politics, a Colorado influencer by the National Campaigns and Elections magazine, and a Colorado insider by the Denver Post during the National Democratic Convention, Ms. Solon is known as one of Colorado's top legislative, media, and political strategists. Sandra provides political insight and commentary for media outlets both locally and nationally, and is a GOP political analyst for Denver news station Fox 31. The Denver Business Journal recognized Capital Solutions as a top 25 public relations firm numerous times. She was a top 3 finalist of the Denver Business Journal's Top Women Business Owners for 3 years, and has been recognized one as Northern Colorado's Business Report's Who's Who in Northern Colorado Business since 2005. Enjoying the strategic challenge of tackling some of Colorado's biggest issues on behalf of clients, Sandra has found success distinguishing herself and her firm as a leader in the areas of transportation, business, land use, development, infrastructure, public finance, banking, technology, oil and gas, energy, utilities, taxation, tourism, and economic development. So with that, please join me in welcoming Sandra Hagen-Solon.
So honored to be here and visit with you all in this panel with some really fantastic experts in the political arena, and just thrilled to be joined by them and to be joined and to join you in this discussion at a really critical point in your industry. The Colorado way is a frontier spirit. It's a ruggedness. It's grit and perseverance. It's straightforward and pragmatic. The Colorado way is innovation. Our people find better ways to solve problems. The Colorado way is independent-minded. It has always supported energy development that drives the economy and improves the environment. The Colorado way has always found the balance between being stewards of our land, air, and water while using our vast resources for Colorado's economic prosperity. Colorado is a state full of transplants. Everyone seems to have come here from somewhere else. In fact, only 40% of us are native-born. The Colorado way is welcoming of all those who are drawn to our values, our qualities, our remarkable beauty, and to our culture. But has Colorado lost its way? Is a new way being forged by an undercurrent of political extremism? The Colorado way does feel under siege from those who don't subscribe to our values, culture, and ethos, and would rather bring their own way to Colorado, threatening the very place and economy that drew them here in the first place. A recent survey found that support for Colorado's legacy industries, from agriculture, oil and gas, among others, by newcomers, those who have been here less than 10 years, plummets, especially among women, but is high among those who've lived here 10 years or longer. What does that tell us? Colorado is no stranger to growth surges, but this surge feels different. This surge has come at a time of political unrest, environmental uncertainty, and unfettered media engagement. The voter demographics reflect and closely correspond to this surge and a marked political shift. Nearly 3.8 million of Colorado's 5.7 million residents are registered to vote. In 2014, there were 3.7 million, but between 2014 and 18, over 800,000 of the registered were new voters. Over 21% of all registered voters were new voters. Almost 400,000, or 50% of those newly registered, were registered as unaffiliated. and only 22% of the new registered were Republican, 27% were registered Democrat. The newly registered voter is decidedly younger, with 61% of the new registered voter between 18 and 34 years old. Another 15% were between 35 and 44. It is clear that the growth of the unaffiliated voter and independent voter is reflective of the independent spirit of the Colorado way. There is a middle that desires a straightforward and pragmatic approach. The oil and gas industry has been at the heart of Colorado, serving as its core industry through the booms and the busts. Today, oil and gas is the #1 industry contributing to our state GDP, as reported by USA Today just last week. In Colorado, we are an industry that is integrally linked to its politics and its policy. No more are we only beholden to the markets and to the per barrel prices. It's been a tough year for the industry that has been ingrained in Colorado's culture and economic foundation. Where there was strong support for oil and gas in past political climates, today we find ourselves on the defense. How is it that as the winners of Proposition 112, we feel like we're the real losers after the passage of Senate Bill 181, a mere 3 months later? But today, we look forward. With this fantastic panel, we dive into a conversation about our neighbors, about the middle, and where we meet them. And we begin to answer the essential question: do we hold steadfastly to the Colorado way as we've known it, or share that narrative proudly? Or do we begin to redefine the Colorado way to reflect a changing political climate and values? We are joined today by 3 fantastic political experts, all of whom bring different perspective to the conversation and unique interests and length of time in the business. We have Nick Triano, who is young and new to the landscape, idealistic and challenging the system as we know it. We have Ted, and quite frankly me, who's a seasoned politico. I've known Ted for years, and I'm just thrilled to have him on the panel today. He brings a pragmatic, realistic view of our ability to bridge that divide. And Kate, young also, she brings a practical perspective, and she has a finger on the pulse of the Republican Party. Let me go into some more specifics about each one of these. Kay Roberts is who we will hear from first. She's worked as a strategist and operations specialist for a slew of corporate and political clients, including presidential campaigns and super PACs. She most recently managed the day-to-day operations of the successful Amendments Y and Z constitutional campaigns. Those were the congressional redistricting campaigns and the state redistricting campaigns, and the Raise the Bar constitutional campaign in 2016. She oversaw the statewide ballot chase program opposing 112 in Colorado and managed the Get Out the Vote program for Iowa's successful Republican gubernatorial candidate in 2018. She started as a project manager in 2011 in EIS Solutions, working her way to a partner in the company. And her focus is on issue campaigns, advocacy, community relations, activities, particularly for the energy industry, forgive me. Nick Troiano, thank you, is a civic entrepreneur based in Denver. Since 2016, he has served as the executive director of Unite America, a national organization that aims to bridge the partisan divide by enacting structural political reforms to unrig the system and elect candidates who put people over party. And then lastly, we have Ted Trimpa. Ted is the principal and CEO of Trimpa Group, a national political consulting and government relations firm that specializes in progressive public policy, advocacy, and political strategy. Ted develops cutting-edge public policy strategies at the state and federal levels. He is one of the country's most sought-after advocates, resulting from his deep understanding of the national and multi-state public policy, political, and nonprofit landscape. Called Colorado's answer to Karl Rove by the Atlantic, Trimpa is a nationally recognized Democrat strategist and operative. He's considered a key architect of the political infrastructure that facilitated the Democrat Party's resurgence in Colorado after decades of Republican dominance. A turnaround so dramatic, the National Review dubbed it the Colorado Miracle. And campaigns and elections recently named him one of the top 5 Democrat players in the state. Will you please welcome me, or join me in welcoming these 3 fantastic political experts. We'll start off the commentary with 5 minutes from each of the panelists, and we're going to start with Kate, and then we're going to move into some questions and discussion with these panelists. But I invite you to share questions. I think there's some cards on the table, and there'll be those around to pick up questions from you, and we'll intersperse those into the discussion as well. So with that, Kate, if you would join us here.
Thanks.
You can.
Great, I'll just sit. Thanks so much, Sandra, and thanks so much to Koga for hosting. It's always a wonderful annual tradition to be at the Energy Summit here in Denver, and I really look forward to the next 2 days. I echo what Sandra said. It's wonderful to be a part of this panel this morning, especially here with Ted and Nick. I think, I look at Ted Trimpa, such a tough partisan here in Colorado, but also, one of the good guys on energy issues. He's with us, and I know ultimately he just really wants what's best for the state. So thanks, Ted. And for those of you who have not gotten to know Nick yet, I also echo what Sandra said. We've worked together on some of the redistricting reforms in Colorado, and we're taking that model nationwide, and Nick's truly an up-and-comer. So if you don't know him yet, don't leave this conference without getting to talk to him. Many of you in this room I know I've worked with on local government issues, regulatory issues, and it's so good to see so many familiar faces, but I also moonlight on ballot issue campaigns, so I'm really excited for the discussion today. Sandra talked in particular about some of the registration trends here in Colorado, and I just want to set the stage this morning so we can go through the discussion thinking about a couple other things. We all know in Colorado how engaged the electorate is here. We in 2018 had the 2nd highest turnout in the nation, up from 4th highest in the nation in 2016. I think that's a great thing for Colorado, but it also means our voters are very dialed in. We're also seeing voters start to turn in their ballots closer and closer to Election Day, really doing their homework, really studying the issues, researching the candidates, and I think part of that is because of their level of engagement. Part of it's also because we're starting to get a hang of this all-mail ballot thing, but I think just another thing for us to think about today when we talk about how to appeal to voters. And we know they have to do homework, right? Because there's literally dozens of questions on each ballot every year, and that's just the questions, not the candidates. So this is definitely a really engaged group. Since our voters are so informed, we also know that they're really craving a couple things. They're craving authenticity, not only from candidates, but from issues as well. And then once they make their decisions, they're really craving accountability. They want candidates to do what they say they were going to do, and they also want, issues or ideas that get passed to follow through. They want to know where the money's going, for example. They want to know what audit processes are in place. Did the program we voted in work? These are the types of questions that we get here in Colorado, and I will say that's not true for the rest of the nation. So kudos to all the Colorado voters out there. I think today's topic really hits the nail on the head when we talk about the movable middle. We're going to get into this a lot. I think it goes without saying, based on the registration numbers that Sandra listed, that unaffiliateds are such a key to Colorado's future. And quite frankly, you cannot win statewide in this state if you only appeal to one of the 3 major parties. And to kind of, say that in reverse, you could not lose any major block of voters in the state, I'm talking like 40s, high 30s, on an issue or as a candidate and still win statewide. There's just not enough math for any singular party. And so the movable middle and the unaffiliateds in general are a huge part of this calculus, and that's what we have to think about when we talk about broad-based appeal. And this speaks to my approach on ballot issues in particular in this state. And when I think of you, the energy industry, and the issues that always seem to come every year in your space, I really want you to think about this math and this appeal. Republicans may be your base, and don't get me wrong, we love you, but there are just simply not enough of us to win statewide. Same with Democrats. If you completely alienate or isolate Democrats with an issue or a thought that's just totally untenable to them, you can only afford to lose so many before you're completely gone. And unaffiliateds, they're not with either party for a reason. They want robust environmental protections, but they also do not want to see their neighbors lose their jobs, and they do not want to see this industry put out of work in the state. They're the same voters that swept Democratic candidates last year, but also voted down major tax increases and other progressive policies like 112. So when I think we think about this discussion today, I just want to think about how do you create that broad-based appeal, whether you're a Republican, whether you're an issue, to really get what you want in the end.
Thank you, Kate, very much. Nick.
Thank you. Well, it's good to be with everyone this morning. Thank you for being here and for Koga for having us. I wanted to start off by talking about two things that happened this year in politics for the first time, at least in the last century, which I think are quite emblematic of the environment that we're in. The first is after the 2018 midterm elections, there's now only one state with a divided legislature, meaning in all of the other states, either the Democrats or the Republicans control both the House and the Senate. Does anyone know the state that's the exception? Minnesota. So Colorado used to be among that group, no longer. There's one state left, and that's the first time that's happened since, I think, 1914. So if you add in the governorships, now there are 35 states that are controlled entirely by one party or another, and that has opened up an express lane, essentially, for either of the parties to pass what we're seeing as increasingly conservative legislation in red states and increasingly progressive legislation in blue states. And that has set up this past legislative session to be awfully contentious, as there's less incentive to find common ground and work across the aisle. Which brings me to the second pretty extraordinary thing that we saw in politics this year here in Colorado in the Colorado State Senate. Legislation was happening so quickly, the Senate Republicans decided to force the Democrats to read a 2,000-page bill. That would take 60 hours. So the Senate Democrats decided to bring in 5 computers to read the bill simultaneously, which sounded like a bunch of gibberish. Now, some of you might think that's what it usually sounds like at the Capitol, but even more so on this particular day. So what did some Republicans do? Well, they literally sued the Senate president and the Senate secretary. They went to court. The court ultimately ruled in favor of the Republicans, and so went the session. And so this is the kind of political environment that has taken root because of polarization. Not quite as bad as in Oregon, where the Republicans fled the state, not wanting to take votes on climate legislation, or in Tennessee, where the Democrats staged a walkout, so the Republicans literally had to call the police to bring them back in. I mean, this is what policymaking looks like in an age of growing polarization, which leads people like me as an independent or even as a centrist to feel like that old song, no offense to my distinguished panelists, clowns to the left of me, jokers to the right, and here I am stuck in the middle with you. Two growing extremes. This political environment creates false choices and false binaries. Either side wants to divide. They want to make it a zero-sum game and ultimately to turn out votes and money, ultimately for the party that we hate the least. And it's in that environment that both sides have been reduced to caricatures. I mean, if you're a voter not paying really close attention to politics, you might think the choice is between one side that wants to line its pockets by drilling wells on children's playgrounds, or another side that is perfectly fine annihilating the economy because we want zero emissions by noon tomorrow. I mean, this is what the political debate has become in this polarization. So it's hard for evidence-based policymaking to occur in a really rational way. Instead, the political system has largely been about placating either extremes. So that may not all be news to you. The question is, well, what do we do about it? Here in Colorado, according to one study, we have the most polarized legislature in the country. We've taken some proactive steps to addressing this problem through some structural reforms. In 2014, we began mailing a ballot to every registered voter. That helped reduce costs by 40%, increased turnout by 7%. 2016, we opened party primaries to independent voters, which meant last election, 280,000 independents were finally able to participate in publicly funded elections. And then in 2018, thanks to the great work of Kate and others, Amendments Y and Z passed will end the practice of partisan gerrymandering. With these reforms, all we'll accomplish is making our political system more participatory, have more competition, more accountability, which is all steps in the right direction of reducing polarization, and there's more to be done. That could be done, from ending the state's caucus system to thinking about a nonpartisan primary or bringing in ranked choice voting. These are all things that our organization, Unite America and Unite Colorado, are supportive of. We think to get better governance, you need to have better incentives, you need to have better leadership. And I'll end on making the point about better leadership because that's really where we're focused in 2020, which is that most elections, because of how districts are drawn and how we've sorted ourselves geographically, most elections are decided in the primaries. So the type of Democrat and the type of Republican that you get is basically the best leverage point to how you shape a legislature. These elections are relatively low turnout, and so they're primed for groups to mobilize around issues they really care about. And so we'll be one of the groups trying to mobilize in both parties' primaries to elect people who put their constituents first and who are willing to work across the aisle to get things done in a more pragmatic way. I look forward to discussing that more so on the panel today. Thank you.
Thank you. Nick, Ted, your thoughts?
So
And with one comment, I love what he's wearing today.
Yeah, it's Denver
He's
Rustlers.
here for the Denver Rustlers, but didn't it go nicely with my Colorado Way speech? It's like perfect.
No, I'm on my way to Pueblo to help buy livestock, which is a good thing.
Yes.
So I want to divide up my introductory comments into kind of 4 areas. One, a basic overview. Two, where I think the parties are and the challenges that both face. 3 is the overall polarization that's happening and the ground game that's playing and how I believe the industry is going to have to play differently. And then the 3rd is about the money, because in the end, in politics, believe it or not, in elections, I know you guys know this, it is about the money. So overview, this is not a blue state. Anybody who says that this is a blue state for the long haul, I tell you, you're high. And I can say that, I do cannabis work. We had a wave this last cycle, and this last cycle, what it proved is suburban women really don't like Trump. I still think that we're going to see elections that are in the 2 to 3% range. So a little bit of good news, and that is at some point, I do think we're going to have a more competitive environment here in Colorado. I don't think that's going to happen, though, for the next 2 cycles. We're going to talk about that at the very end. So what are the challenges that Democrats are facing today and Republicans are facing? And I've said this a lot for those, or the 17 people that watch John Caldera's show, that, well, it's true. I mean, I love John, it's a fun show. But what the Republican Party has got to figure out is who the hell you are. And you're facing an extraordinary challenge, and quite frankly, thank God we don't have the pitched battle. We have one, but not quite as bad as the Republicans face, and that is the Trump wing and then the traditional Republican wing, and I'm using traditional loosely. And the Trump wing, when you take a look at Republican primary voters in Colorado, approval for Trump is at 94%, 94. And then you ask that group, what do they stand for? It's, a myriad of answers, and it's usually determined by whatever Trump has said that day. So we've got to figure out how to bring peace, and I think that this next election, hopefully, some of that will start. I'm not for sure what else that you can do other than start changing some of the underlying infrastructure, which I want to talk about here in a second, because that's number 3. On the Democratic side, believe it or not, we are facing a problem too. And you can watch this play out in the Democratic primary for president with Bernie on the far left. Elizabeth Warren has been playing very smartly, just a touch to the right of Bernie. and then Joe Biden, who's supposed to be representing the centrist wing, stumble at least 3 or 4 times a day, which is hurting the ability for centrists to have a comeback within the party. So what does that mean in Colorado? What that means in Colorado is leadership is in a very challenging situation, and that is they know that in order to stay in power, in order for us to continue to win elections, because we're going to be going back to margins of 2 and 3%, they can't allow the left to get too far ahead of them. And because we were so successful last election cycle, there are more people who want to do those kinds of things. And so what you're going to continue to see is this pull. And what I would recommend is a little bit of lowering the heat when you see some of these bills that are introduced, because every state legislator can do 5, and some of these folks do some crazy ass things, and hopefully leadership will be able to steer that. You're going to see more of this ridiculous stuff in the House just because of the margins that are there. You'll see a little bit in the Senate, but I think Senate leadership, particularly Steve Finberg, even though he's from Boulder, has a broader view as to what's going on, and I think can help maintain some of that. But what I do want to talk about is the environmental movement, which is when we're going to talk about money. So what about infrastructure? People ask, why do Democrats win in Colorado when we are far from being the majority? And I can say, as someone who's been involved in this for over a dozen years, and one of many architects, not the only one, we have built an underlying infrastructure that's around year-round. I mean, we don't reinvent the wheel or do the same thing on each election cycle, so that is reason 1. Reason 2, we get every interest that is spending money in elections into a room. It's pay to play, and everybody has to work together. There's none of this SEIU is out on their own doing their thing. The trial lawyers are out on their own doing their thing. The environmental community, except for the wackadoos on the left, which we're going to talk about in the end, are out doing their own thing. But with that kind of coordination, you first of all, take out 30% of the costs because you're not, doing the same thing on each one of those. And you're also able to develop what I think is a more focused strategy. And I think what the Republicans have had a challenge with, and quite frankly, the oil and gas industry's had a challenge with, they think that their individual interest groups can kind of do it on their own, that you can do it on your own. And you're just by design are setting yourselves up. And then the other piece to this is for all of our folks that are sitting at the table, we don't have one policy discussion, not one. The only thing we care about is winning. And it seems to me that because of this fractured way of doing politics, the way Republicans do politics, it's not necessarily always driven by winning. It's driven by, okay, we want to win, but they have to be really good on this particular issue. I think that in the short term is a mistake. The last one, money. Money makes the world go around in politics, and that by coordinating all the people that are sitting around that table and then developing assets that you have that are around all the time helps you win elections. And we do a lot of data, a ton of data, and we have a field program that's completely coordinated. We have a media program that's completely coordinated, and that helps us. But I can tell you what a challenge that's going on within the Democratic Party, in particular in relating to oil and gas, is, believe it or not, the environmental community is not all of the 112 types. The 112 types is a small slice that's very loud, that is getting a little bit of traction, and you have the mainstream environmental community that is not in the 112. We spent months doing research, the mainstream environmental community. Maggie Fox was one of the ones leading it, and trying to figure out, is there a way to use this kind of data to tell the 112 people, one, they're going to get the ass kicked, and two, there's going to be a ton of money spent on them, and it's going to continue to drive that wedge within the Democratic caucus. I still think that with the leadership that we have today, we'll be able to control some of that. But I'm not going to sit here and tell you that everything is going to be rosy for the oil and gas industry, because it's not. Will there be a 181 fix bill? I will be stunned if there's not. It's a question of how far is that going to go. So I think the challenge that the industry is facing is that because of how I think the election cycles are going to go in 2022, possibly in 24, you have a tough road to hoe. And I have some ideas about what I think you should do, which I think we're going to get to with some questions later on.
Great, perfect. Thank you, Ted, and thanks to all three of you for sharing your perspectives from this political spectrum that exists here. I think a big component of the conversation today really is about that movable middle and where we can find sources of support. And if you all can help from your particular perspective more narrowly define or more specifically define that movable middle. And why don't we start with Nick, given your perspective from the unaffiliated voter?
Sure. I tend to live in the middle,
Yes.
The movable middle. I think the first really important thing to understand about the movable middle is that it's very different in the context of thinking about issue campaigns and ballot initiatives in the movable middle when it comes to elections. On the latter, increasingly in politics, what we're seeing when it comes to electoral campaigns is that it's driven by identity and not by issues. Identity meaning we have sorted ourselves into these two tribes, which now they used to be just one part of our identity, but now they seem to represent, race and religion and class and geography. And so Democrat, Republican become sort of mega identities in the sense that you vote with your team. So here in Colorado, across the country, we see less split ticket voting. The true number of swing voters, maybe it's someplace between 5 or 8%. It certainly can move the election, but it's a shrinking number of people. And so it becomes harder in general elections to actually find and mobilize those voters that may impact the outcome. On issues, though, when people are faced with propositions like 112, for example, there's a larger middle of people who might be willing to consider what their position is when you don't have a party label next to it. And I think that's really where the opportunity is. There's a great report called Hidden Tribes that an organization called More in Common did. And they basically segmented the electorate into 6 different components. On the far left, you had the progressive activists, maybe about 8% of the population. On the far right, you had the devoted conservatives, maybe about 6%. I mean, they're squarely in their camps. And what Hidden Tribes said is they're about 67% of voters in what they called the exhausted majority. And they called it exhausted because they're tired of this partisan politics. Now, the important thing to realize is they're not all independents and they're not all centrists. What they are people across the spectrum, it really is across the spectrum, that desire a politics that's more pragmatic, and they want to see their leaders compromise. And demographically, it may skew a little bit more middle-aged, more women than men, people who are a little bit more educated, but those are the people who are willing to evaluate ideas on their face and not approach issues from a rigid partisan standpoint.
Yeah, I think Nick really hits the nail on the head. The only thing I would add is we're also seeing it in the parties generationally too. Young Republicans don't act the same way on social issues as older Republicans, as one example. So, and I think, we could probably say the same for the left, that young progressives are not motivated or activated by the same issues that sometimes older ones are. So,
Great. And Ted?
So the way we look at the movable middle are the people who don't pay attention. It's to the very, very end when they start realizing what's going on and they try to sort out where they're going to land. And right now, in terms of elections, they are definitely breaking Democratic, about 60-40. That can change. As a recommendation from at least the way I see it, as to what the industry could do about the movable middle, is to continue the ad campaign you have going and do things that don't look political. Because the more political it looks, the less likely people now are going to take a look at it because they see it as part of the partisan fight of what's going on. And so what Nick is talking about is so true. And I think that when you take a look at the extremes, the far right and then the far left being such a small percentage, and the large percentage that is in the middle, that 67%, that's a 67% that is a great market in order to be able to hopefully get a better support around what your issues are. But my one caution is it takes years to do. You know, spending $500,000 or $1 million or $2 million on something and expecting all of that to happen in one election cycle goes back to what I said earlier, you're high.
And I think, too, it can't just be top down, too, because when, you know, I agree with you, Ted, that it has, you know, obviously ad campaigns work because, you know, message and general appeal is pervasive in politics, but authenticity really has to be at the core of it, and that's what you build over years. Because at the end of the day, you can run TV ads over and over and over again, but you get diminishing returns. And so I think what we see and what we saw last fall with 112, and kudos to all the employees in the room, but when you have the employees going out, talking to their neighbors, going door to door, you know, defending their jobs, that coupled with that, with, you know, a media campaign, of course, is when you really start to take these last minute voters, these, I don't really know what's happening until the very end, the folks that are movable, and you actually put a face to the issue. Because I would say that at the end of the day, you know, the TV ads didn't win, you know, no on 112. The employees of this industry really carried it over the finish line.
Yeah, indeed. Perfect. Thank you. Really great insights. I'm going to start with some questions about the different spectrums within each of the sort of universes in which you operate. Certainly, as Ted, as you alluded to, in the environmental community, there's a broad spectrum within the environmental community, just as there is in the Democrat Party generally. But as it relates to the environmentalists specifically, expand a little bit upon your thoughts about the spectrum of the environmental groups, and if you can provide your sense of who among them the industry is most likely to find common ground.
Well, I'm going to go back to 112, and this is where Kate and I might disagree a little bit. Our polling, when we were watching it, we never saw it getting above 45, 46, 47. And in large part was because of the great campaign that was run, but also there isn't the type of energy around that type of policy that some people try to make it out to be. And the more we can try to split that extremism with the mainstream environmental community, the better off you're going to be, because this extremism is, you know, a couple national groups, but mostly pissed off moms, and they really have got something going, and they're taking advantage of situations. And I still think, and I have said this for a number of years, that relationship building with members of the environmental community, even if you disagree, it's an old adage that I have. It's harder to piss on somebody's leg that you know than somebody's leg that you don't. And I think that there's more to be gained by stepping into that space. I'll give you an example with me. You know, everybody knows I've done gay rights work for over 25 years. One of my best friends is Jim Daly, the head of Focus on the Family. That's like our arch enemy. We have dinner together, we talk, we just disagree, but it helps lower some of the heat, and we sometimes start to see that there is some common ground. And I think that there has to be a more concerted effort to do that, and you're going to have to take some of that bias that you may have when you're talking to some of them. But I personally think that the fervor that was developed around 112, and it's, you know, this big movement of the environmentalists and the major environmental organizations are involved, was BS. You know, and it was, you know, ginned up in order to get people ginned up, and a lot of people made a lot of money because of it.
Well, and I don't want to get too far off topic, Sandra, but then I really love your perspective then, Ted, on what we're seeing now. I mean, 9 local moratoriums, you know, after 181, and you're saying this is just fringe and it wasn't really what it was. I mean, we're still seeing it today.
Again, the moratoriums are not being driven by the mainstream environmental community. It is these extreme groups, and you have in a governor, you should ask him about this when he comes in to talk, I think it's tomorrow, who's very much around local control. I mean, I've worked on a number of issues where you try to do a statewide standard, statewide licensing, and Jared's response is, no, I want to let localities do that. Because of that, that then means you've got to play off of what that split is within the environmental community, and you need to do it sooner rather than later.
Very good, thank you, appreciate that. And it's interesting, that perspective, that fringe group, similar on the Republican side, you have the fringe Republicans pursuing the recall elections at the local level. I mean, these organizations have found paths in which to elevate their conversation for their particular issues and move forward.
We
So
have our
very
crazies
divisive.
too.
Yeah, we have our crazy too, for sure. Nick, along similar line of conversation, so just as there exists a broad spectrum of voter within each of the traditional political parties, the unaffiliated voter, as we've discussed, brands a broad spectrum of philosophy and interests. With 56% of the vote, the campaign to defeat Proposition 112 successfully spoke to the unaffiliated voter with messages about jobs, communities, and a responsible industry. Talk a little bit about the spectrum of the unaffiliated voter, and then share your thoughts on how the messages resonated with those messages resonate with the unaffiliated voter today related to oil and gas. And if that voter sentiment has shifted in any way, what messages and actions do you believe will continue to resonate with them to maintain, motivate, and hopefully grow that 56% base of voter?
So to begin in making an obvious point about independence, or that they're independent. What they share in common is that they don't feel well represented by either party, but that's because some of them think the Democrats are too conservative and the Republicans are too liberal. So even in independence, you have your wings. They're not all moderates and they're not all centrists. And so it's a bit harder, and I don't aim to speak for all unaffiliateds. What I will say is on 112, for example, it passed with 56%, but University of Colorado polling showed that among independents or unaffiliateds, 51% voted for it. So they're pretty divided, the unaffiliated community, compared to 75% of Republicans voted no, 75% of Democrats who supported it. And so I think it's about finding the audience of unaffiliateds that are receptive to a message that rejects the false binaries. That's why a lot of people are unaffiliated. It's either this or that on every issue. And what you were saying earlier, I think, resonates with a lot of independent-minded people, which is that you don't have to choose between your environment and having access to affordable energy or a growing economy, and to speak to what the facts of the matter are. And I think oftentimes independents are craving that sort of objective information. Going back to a point before, it's not just the message, it's the messenger. It's not, coming from the industry itself. It's who are the credible messengers that can reflect that point of view. If I care about the economy, who can deliver that message? If I care about affordable energy, who can credibly deliver that to unaffiliateds as well? So it's a broad spectrum within the unaffiliated community. It almost looks like a bell curve ideologically, but right now, the clear majority of independents and unaffiliateds are more so voting Democratic, and that, again, has to go with the sort of the binary that exists today.
Mm-hmm. Very good, thank you. Interesting, I wasn't aware that 51% of the unaffiliated voted for Proposition 112. I think that does demonstrate some interesting perspective about just how broad the interests are, but again, reinforces our need to build messages that speak to that middle group. Kate, certainly on the Republican side, throughout our country's history, Republicans have been really leaders in preserving natural lands and creating policies that benefit our economy and environment. Teddy Roosevelt, of course, created the national parks, the national forest system. Richard Nixon created the EPA, highlighting the importance of clean air and clean water. Ronald Reagan was committed the country to the Montreal Treaty, and was one of the most successful environmental treaties. Of course, George H.W. Bush implemented the acid rain trading program. But their narrative in recent years, of course, has been that conservatives and Republicans are anti-environment, anti-conservation, and pro all things bad for the environment. With the blue wave that hit Colorado, that gave us our trifecta government, AG and Secretary of State, they're making and passing and promoting progressive policies, and with progressive policymaking and the continued influx of new voters, liberal voters, what do you see as the pathway for Republicans to really regain any control of any of the major offices and legislative bodies?
Right. Well, I mean, 2018 was obviously a pretty bad year for Republican candidates. And I mean, kudos to the Democrats. We all love having years like that. And quite frankly, long term, I'm bullish on a Republican comeback, but short term, I'm not. I personally think that Trump is a disaster up and down the ticket for Republicans. And so I agree, Ted, that I don't see 2020 or 2022, unfortunately, for Republicans looking quite different. And I hope I'm proven wrong. But I do think there are some things that we need to do to get back to that place. The first is, as Republicans, we all have to acknowledge that we are our candidates. And we need to make sure that as a party, we can be viewed as open-minded, as a good governing party. And that means we can't just nominate the next guy in line, quite frankly. You look, there's been some good polling nationwide about popular governors, and Morning Consult last year did one that said that Charlie Baker in Massachusetts, most popular governor in that poll. Second most popular was Larry Hogan from Maryland. These are two Republican governors in left-leaning states, and they appeal to voters more broadly than just their party. They show that they're bigger than politics. And so when I think about Colorado Republicans and how we set up candidates for the future, I think we need, quite frankly, a little bit more Larry Hogan and a little less Tom Tancredo when it comes to candidates. The second, actually, it is money. And it was great because, Ted, for you to talk about that segue early on, because it's absolutely true. And as Republicans, we need to do a better job at that. I mean, I think, when was your meeting? Probably December 2017, probably earlier, right? To plan for the cycle and get organized. And progressives have this round table. And therefore, they have a tactical advantage that we just are not matching. Furthermore, they have a financial advantage that we're also not matching. And if we want to play on their level and make gains in the next cycle, we have to be able to meet them toe-to-toe. So.
Indeed. Perfect. Nick, I think you wanted to comment.
There's one point, because I think Kate's right that the party are their candidates. And again, going back to the point about how primaries determine that, one example from last cycle is there's a freshman state rep named Colin Larson who won his primary just by 180 votes. That's how close it was in a very low turnout election. And he wound up being the only Republican to vote for the ban on gay conversion therapy in the legislature. Trust me, that's where the future of the Republican Party is with the demographics and where Republican voters will be. Similarly, in the session before that, there was one Republican who stood for a red flag bill on guns. And then, he was threatened to be stripped of his leadership assignment. So there are some Republicans that are being responsive to where the future of the party is going. And I think the party would be wise to elevate those kinds of candidates in their own primaries.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I would add to this, a strategy that I think the industry should be employing is to play in primaries, and particularly play in Democratic primaries. Our world is not ready for that yet. And I think that I'm going to get in trouble for talking about this, but that's okay.
Take quick notes.
I think there is a real opportunity to capitalize on this because in our world, we've kind of assumed we stay out of that space. We help select candidates, making sure that we have folks that we think can actually win. But in terms of actually playing in the primary, it's rare for us to do that. And I think that given where the underlying political infrastructure here is going to be for the next few cycles, it would bode well for the industry to start thinking about how they play in primaries. And I would do it in conjunction with some other Republican interests.
Yeah, I think, Nick, you had spoken, I think this conversation about the primaries is really important. Our political structure is such that is where the game is being played. However, I find it interesting, of course, with redistricting. The theory goes that we should have a system newly structured in which most, if not most, of the seats are competitive. In the meantime, until such time as redistricting happens, how do you all leverage, and particularly how does Unite America and those in the party leverage the existing political structure in order to take advantage of and position more moderate, pragmatic candidates moving forward? So I'll start with Nick and how you what is your organization doing? How are you playing? You're new into the game. What's your funding? I mean, how do you think you'll be able to effectively accomplish your objectives? And then I'd like Kate and Nick,
Sure.
Ted's perspective on that as well.
Last cycle, we focused on actually running independents for office. I mean, there's 100 legislators in the state. Not one is an independent, despite basically 40% of voters being independent. But if you think you had a rough legislative session this past year, it was tough an election for us. Our candidates all lost because the structure of our electoral process is really designed to benefit the two major parties. So that's why we've shifted our focus to supporting independent-minded folks in both parties' primaries. And I would say the key differentiating factor we can make a difference is on candidate recruitment and leadership development. I mean, there were 164 primary elections in 2018 on both sides. Just 20 of them were contested. That means the rest didn't. There was only one person from either party. And so how do we build a pipeline of leaders who view politics as public service and not just political activists who are there to advance a sort of narrow ideological agenda? So I think we have to be able to advance the leadership pipeline, and then we have to be able to mobilize resources. Right now, the vast majority of all the money spent in elections happens in just a handful of districts in the general elections, trying to determine the partisan outcome. There was only 2 competitive elections in the Senate and 8 in the House, meaning elections decided by less than 10 points. All the rest are safe. So that means the only way of determining those elections is in the primary. Very few organizations, very few political operatives are sort of playing in that realm. So there's a difference to be made there about how do you mobilize resources, early support for candidates, and building a community of donors, actually, to give directly to the candidates to help their campaigns launch. There's a wonderful model out there. We're not inventing this from scratch, called Govern for California. In fact, our political director came from running that organization for 6 years. Over the course of 4 election cycles, they won 51 out of 53 primaries. And so they're reshaping both parties through the primary process, and that's something that we aim to do here in Colorado.
It's something you could do is, because part of what the challenge I know you guys have is it's the oil and gas industry. And when people in my world hear oil and gas industry, particularly as of late, they think of 74, which is a real sour taste in a lot of people's mouths. They think of the kind of, we believe, blown out of proportion worry about 112. And so something I think that we should consider, as me being part of the industry too, I have to disclose I represent Noble, is I think using organizations that quite frankly know some of this and can do it, and also have a brand that is going to be appealing. And that's something like what Unite America can do. So it's not just the oil and gas industry playing in a primary, but it's Unite America playing in a primary, funded by multiple people. And then just making sure that as you fund, that you work directly with them, so that you're just not like handing money off to somebody.
And furthermore, when issues come up in the business community that aren't just narrowly related to oil and gas, how is this industry engaging with partners? Because when the 112 comes up, or the big issue for energy, you're asking the rest of the community to come and help you. And so are you looking at things that aren't just so narrowly oil and gas related, not only because it's good for the state and good for your employees and people who work here and the broader business community as a whole, but these are relationships that have to be cultivated over time. You can't just stand these up in June of an election year, and scramble.
Very good. Thank you for that insight. We've gotten a couple of questions from the audience, and one actually is along the lines of a question I was going to inquire of Ted. Specifically, the person asks, you say the pro-112 crowd represents an extremist faction, not necessarily mainstream environmental organizations, but the state Democrat Party endorsed it. Has the party been captured by anti-oil and gas forces? And I'll build on that a little bit in that, of course, Bernie Sanders was chosen by the Democrat Party in the last primary in Colorado, and similarly appears to be leading in the polls here, and he's someone who is, of course, against the oil and gas industry in many respects. So is there room in the Democrat Party for employees in the oil and gas industry
So-
specifically, but how does that operate with the Democrat Party?
So let's first of all start with data that Nick gave from the common, I can't remember, I always forget the last. More in common, and that is there are extremes, and the extremes that are within each party are in single digits. I think it's what, 6 and 6, right? The same thing is happening here. Now, I'm sure a number of you are like, well, wait a minute, all these Democratic legislators endorsed 112. The party endorsed 112. It must be the policy of the party. You know, it's, if you're in that position, let's take Casey Becker, the Speaker of the House. The last thing in the world she wanted to do was endorse 112, but her district, she had to. Just because they're endorsing doesn't mean that's where they are. And the state party, in all the years I've been doing Democratic politics, you know how many state conventions I've gone to? 1. And when I went to that, I swore to God I would never go again. And so yes, maybe there should be some concern, but to say that that 112 crowd has overtaken the party just isn't true. Now, are they having an effect, you know, in what the regulatory environment is right now with 181? Yes, and it's troubling to a number of us that are left of center but not far left. But again, this comes back to the importance of reaching out to that mainstream group, really developing those relationships, and playing in some of these Democratic primaries.
Well, and you know, Ted, trust me, like I said at the onset, you're one of the good guys. But you know, the word you just used is concern, and I think it is a real concern. I mean, you talk about Casey Becker and her constituents. You have Polis and Fenberg and Becker, all from the Boulder area. And you know, while respectfully, I understand that, you know, you said earlier on that Fenberg wants to look at something a little bit broader and sees the world broader than that. I mean, quite frankly, 181 was released on a Friday night, you know, so there is still some residual distrust from that, and there's still, you know, some major concerns with the current regulatory environment.
But 181 was also negotiated over a period of months, too. So, I mean,
well, and I think that's where, I'll give you that. Speaker Becker did a good job.
Leadership was stuck in a position, and that is with 112's loss, they had to figure out some way to try to take out some of the wind in the sails in terms of what was coming in and be able to say, hey, we've already done something, so we don't have to do this. And I realize that the bill is an anathema to a number of people in this room, but I can say it could have been a lot worse.
Well, and you know, now we're looking at 9 local moratoriums and a lot of uncertainty, so I think that's where it's kind of where I fall.
Yeah. Well, we're quickly running out of time. This has been a fantastic discussion. I'd like to give each one of you a minute of closing remarks. And the question being, what advice do you give the industry as we look at 2020 and as we look at the future in Colorado, as the industry continues to defend, protect, and promote their industry that not only puts food and clothing on the table and backs on those who work in the sector, but on the backs and on the tables of all of Colorado. What advice do you provide in these closing moments?
Yeah, well, thanks again, Sandra, and it's been really fun, guys, so thanks so much. I think the first thing that I'll touch on is kind of tying back to what we talked about with the movable middle. There's definitely a path. I think that, and Nick's given us some really good advice on what to do. And you know, for me, it really comes down to making sure that the relationships in this state, and I think Ted's even said a little bit about this too, about bridge building. You know, relationships in the state have to be authentic. And I know many of you in this room are running really good programs with stakeholders in this state, whether that's landowners or local governments or, you know, nonprofits, the list goes on and on. But, you know, I challenge you to go, you know, back to your offices, look at your programs, look at the relationships you're building with local stakeholders, and even if you think you're doing a good job, set the bar higher and do more, because this does take years and it doesn't happen overnight, and a lot of you want to be in this state for a long time, and that's really what it's going to take.
Great. Thank you, Nick.
I would say, looking at the last election, energy and the environment was the top issue for unaffiliateds. It was in the top several for all voters. It was the top issue for unaffiliateds. And so they're an audience that wants to hear stand on it. And I think it's important to lean into a pro-environmental message and to underscore how that's not mutually exclusive with a $14 billion industry that employs 90,000 people here in the state. I think when the Amazon is on fire and Greenland is melting, it's an emotional issue to a lot of people right now. I mean, in the last 4 years, the number of people who say they're very concerned about climate change has increased 10 points. And so I would think lean into that, especially among unaffiliated voters who really care about this issue, and explain how it's not in conflict with the important and good work that you're doing.
Okay, I'm going to be the Debbie Downer. I think we need to be prepared for this next election. I think that with Trump down 12 points in Colorado and his favorability so in the tank, we really have a strong headwind that we're going to have, and I think a lot of voters are just going to be voting Democratic because they see it as an anti-Trump vote, which makes what Nick is talking about all the more important, because we have to try to break in somehow, but I think we need to face the fact that we're in an environment that's going to be tough for a couple cycles, and so I go back to my old adage that I said earlier, it's harder to piss on somebody's leg that you know than somebody's leg that you don't. And so the more relationship building you can do within the traditional environmental community and try to play off of that divide, the more success, you at least increase the likelihood of having some success.
Great. Thank you all very much for your insights and perspective. And I challenge, of course, all of you to engage. I know you all have been. It's been exhausting, and it sounds like it will be another several years of difficult work ahead, but by virtue of the advice and insights that have been provided here, our hope is that you've found some pathways to influence, to talk to your neighbor, to engage in ways that can move that middle, move those who aren't paying attention, and ultimately we can find some success in this political climate. Thank you all.
Thank you.